This one, as you can see, is about labor supply chains in the Arab or Persian Gulf, building back freer. We have been doing a series here at the Gilder Lehrman Center of podcasts, webinars, interviews about all kinds of issues, from the medical past of slavery to voting rights in our current situation, to mass incarceration, and especially these webinars on problems in modern slavery. We have had an initiative now here at the GLC on modern slavery and human trafficking for nearly a decade. We have had many fellows come through. We've sponsored working groups and 2 big international conferences on this subject. My job here today is just to introduce the panel and briefly introduce the subject, and then get out of the way, and I'll return later during some of the Q&A. So welcome to all of you out there. First of all, the naming of this. We're calling this labor supply chains in the Arab Gulf at the urging of our panelists. But this is, of course, a contested name for what many people call the Persian Gulf, and some as well called the Arab Gulf. The 2 terms do get used interchangeably, but it is a contested term depending on which side of the Gulf you are on, or which side of the Gulf you're talking about. But we want everyone out there to know this is both the Persian Gulf and the Arab Gulf, whichever term we actually use. This is a region of the world that has long relied on imported labor, long before the vast growth of that region that has occurred in recent years. And it is an area of the world that abolished slavery within living memory in the 20th century. It is an area that has experienced tremendous growth in construction of huge sites, skyscrapers, athletic facilities, and so on in recent years. And it is an area full of the problem, or relying on the source, of migrant camps. And it is therefore a hotbed for this question, this issue, this problem of migrant labor, imported labor, and exploited labor in the world today. I want to introduce our panel, beginning first with our 2 chairs of this event, and my 2 colleagues here at Yale. First is Lou Sidibaka. Lou is many things. He is currently a fellow in modern slavery here at the Gilder Lehrman Center. But Lou was born and raised on a cattle ranch in Iowa. He did his undergraduate work at Iowa State University. His family ancestry goes all the way back to probably 1527. But after doing his law degree at the University of Michigan, he went on to become one of the most important, indeed a legendary litigator, especially by the 1990s, on issues combating human trafficking. He argued many, many cases of this, including the famous case of United States versus Kill Sue Lee, which was the largest slavery case under law ever litigated in the United States. He then became ambassador for human trafficking, or ambassador combating trafficking in persons, in the US State Department. In the Obama administration, worked closely with Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. He spent many, many years in the Justice Department before that, and he pioneered a particular method called the victim-centered approach to litigating against modern slavery. He also has pioneered the use of the 13th Amendment in cases against modern slavery. I'll turn this over to Lou in just a moment. Kate Cooney is my colleague here at Yale in the Yale School of Management. She's a senior lecturer at the Yale School of Management. She did her PhD at UCLA, She studies and writes about, and has published many, many articles about uh, business ethics and business in the social sectors. Um, she's written a great deal about corporate supply chain transparency. And indeed, she is co-chair of a grant project with Lou DeBarca that the Gilder Lehrman Center was lucky to receive from the Macmillan Center for the Study of International and Area Studies here at Yale. She writes about and teaches about social enterprise, market-based approaches to poverty, and is a very important player in this particular panel and in everything that we're doing with webinars and outreach on the question of modern slavery. I'll turn it over to these two co-chairs in a moment, but I want to introduce the panel, and I believe I have this in the order they will speak. First of all, Elizabeth France. She's a division director at the Open Society Migration Initiatives Fair Work Program. The Open Society is run by the Soros Foundation, as some may know. She works on and promotes just and equitable working conditions for migrants and refugees in low-wage jobs. She did her PhD at the London School of Economics in anthropology and has spent about 15 years working in the migration and refugee field. She has worked a great deal with and on the subject of domestic workers, migrant domestic workers in the Arab regions of the Arab Gulf and of other parts of the world. She's also worked in the American University in Cairo Center for Migration and Refugee Studies. Fabian Goa is the research manager at Fair Square Projects. He leads a project called 5 Corridors Project with a particular focus on Nepal, Kuwait, and Qatar, and about these nations and places as migration corridors in the world. He has over a decade of experience working in all sorts of human rights organizations. He's worked on corporate accountability and ethics. He's worked on business and social responsibility. He was a special advisor on sports and labor rights for Amnesty International. And Fabian did his graduate work at Queen's University at the University of London. He currently lives in Paris. And Elizabeth, by the way, currently lives in London. Matthew Harper is a historian who did his PhD at UCLA in African history. He is currently a professor of history at the California Polytechnic State University at San Luis Obispo. His book, terrific book, which almost won the Frederick Douglass Book Prize, which we sponsor here at the Gilder Lehrman Center, is entitled Slaves of One Master, Globalization and Slavery in Arabia in the Age of Empire. It was published by Yale Press in 2015. He's written about the Indian Ocean and particularly about the question of East African migrant labor taken often as slaves into the Persian Gulf, Arab Gulf. And I must tell you, in that book, Slaves of One Master, please get it. You will learn a great deal about 2 harrowing parts of this story, which Matthew will pick up on today. And that is the development of the date plantations and the date industry in the Gulf, and the pearl diving or pearl industry in the Gulf. And I must say too, Matt wrote an essay for and helped us produce a book out of a conference we did here at the Gilder Lehrman Center at Yale about at least 8 years ago now, 7 or 8 years ago, on the history of slavery and the slave trade in the Indian Ocean. And Matt is our practicing historian on this panel, although in some ways, everybody here is probably in some way a practicing historian. And last, our commentator, Andrew Crane, I will introduce at the end of the three presentations and the initial discussion. Andrew will be our commentator toward the end, just before we open to a broader Q&A session. So welcome to all of our guests out there on numerous continents and in various time zones, and welcome to the panel. I want to say up front very quickly that Daniel Vera, our media and technology person here at the GLC, has managed to engineer all of this and make it work for us. So thank you, Daniel. And also Song Kim, who is just recently a graduate of the SOM, the School of Management here at Yale, and was Kate Cooney's student, has worked behind the scenes to organize this entire panel. I want to thank the rest of my GLC staff, especially Michelle Zaks, my associate director, for helping put all of this together. So at this point, welcome everybody, and I want to turn this over to both Lou and Kate, who will begin to introduce the session and why we're doing this about the Arab and Persian Gulf at this point in time. Thank you. It's all yours, Lou.
Actually, I want to welcome everybody to,
okay,
I'll take it from here. Thank you so much, David, for that lovely introduction. I just want to welcome everyone who's joining us today. I'm going to just spend a little bit of time tying this webinar to the work we did in the previous webinar, looking at supply chains in the context of COVID-19 and real motivation to sort of come through this on the other side with a different set of practices, right? This theme of building back freer, building back differently. The COVID-19 crisis has provided a window into the global nature of supply chains and the vulnerabilities inherent in this reliance on globally dispersed product chains. Since January, when China began to respond to the COVID-19 crisis, but even before that, as disruptive geopolitical forces and environmental events began to highlight that the dominant mode of supply chain management, centered on minimal inventory and low cost, is less resilient in times of crisis. It's been a wake-up call as wealthy countries like the United States face shortages, rationing, prioritization of customers, lower numbers of SKUs, and continuing challenges getting key medical supplies and technologies needed to address this crisis. The crisis, and this is where we've been focusing, has also highlighted the vulnerabilities of workers laboring along these supply chains, as we've seen higher rates of illnesses and even death in places like meat packing plants, a lack of transparency about worker risks at distribution fulfillment centers, and at the height of the lockdown, concerns about the treatment of workers in the face of global spikes in demand in key nodes in the global supply chains, such as the Malaysian glove factories. In our last webinar, which I know Michelle has posted a link to on the GLC YouTube channel in the chat function, we discussed some of the lessons learned from new legislative approaches to stamp out the most extreme forms of labor exploitation: the California Transparency Supply Chain Act and the UK Modern Slavery Act. One of the takeaways from that conversation was just how difficult it was, the difficulty of traditional supply chain mapping techniques in effectively addressing even the most severe coercive labor practices, such as indentured labor, debt bondage, forced labor, servitude, and human trafficking. A growing set of researchers and activists are arguing that part of the problem may be conceptual. We have been putting too much focus on product supply chains rather than labor supply chains. So in today's webinar, we're turning our attention to what has been learned about attempts to understand and better regulate conditions for migrant flows in a particular region of the world, with the aim to refocus on labor supply chains more generally as a key structural feature of the global economy where worker exploitation has the potential to thrive. Labor market intermediaries, such as labor recruiters, temp agencies, mediate the relationship between employers and workers, and have grown, especially in more unpleasant, high turnover positions, such as assembly and packaging in countries like my own country context, the US. In the US, for example, in the 1970s, there were about 250,000 jobs coded as temporary employment. By 2000, this had grown to 2.7 million. Urban geographers such as Jamie Peck and Nick Theodore have highlighted that these arrangements move risk from the employer to the employee, as the employer can more easily keep wages low and reduce responsibility for workers' compensation, unemployment insurance, and health insurance. But perhaps just as important, mirroring the just-in-time product supply chain practices, these temporary mediated work arrangements can buffer firms against economic volatility. Peck and Theodore have shown in their work that in the recession of 2001, while temp workers in the US were just 2.5% of the workforce, they represented 26% of net job losses, a pattern that repeated itself on a larger scale in the economic downturn of 2008. International labor migration is also increasing. According to Philip Martin in his book, Merchants of Labor, in 2015, there were 244 million international migrants who were outside their country for a year or more, which is up more than 50% from the 155 million in 1990, and which represents more than 3% of the Earth's people. Further, at least half of the world's international migrants are in the labor force of the receiving country, making international migrants an average of 10% of the industrial country labor forces, and very important to certain sectors in migrant receiving economies, from agriculture and construction to health services and IT. So as a focal case study, as David said, we've invited speakers to draw on lessons from their work on labor supply chains in the Gulf region. And I'm going to turn it over to Lou, who's going to give some context setting for the discussion we will then have.
Well, I'm going to do a very quick, and thank you, Daniel, for pulling up that slide. I'm going to do a very quick bird's eye view of the region. Since it is the region that we're talking about, I guess that would be a falcon's eye view that we're using. The Gulf, when we're talking about the Gulf in this context, we're not necessarily talking about that body of water that you see in this slide that enters between Oman and Iran and goes all the way up to Iraq. Much of what we're really talking about is the Gulf Cooperation Council, the GCC. The GCC is a organization that was founded in 1981. It contains several of the countries that you see on that map: Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. Basically, it's, I guess, the southwest portion of the Persian Gulf itself, all the countries on the Arab side except for Iraq. And these countries have a lot of similarities. They have often a shared history. They continue to all be monarchies, and they kind of collectively transitioned over the course of just a few decades in the 20th century from being a place that was largely of fishing, pearls, dates, trade, a lot of the kind of things that you would see in the Arab empires of the 1400s through the 20th century. And one of the things that we see is the, sorry, you might be hearing, we've got folks outside doing some yard work. You might be hearing some of that. I apologize for that. But one of the things that we see is this explosion in wealth and you also see the alignment of the political systems. The GCC countries, along with Lebanon and Jordan, all end up adopting an immigration system that's called the kafala system. And in the kafala system, you have the immigration status of the workers dependent upon their sponsor, the kafil. Now, this is not unique to this region. It gets a lot of attention, but I think that it's important for us to note that this is not a problem of the kafala system. This is not a problem of Islam or Islamic law or Arab law. This is a situation that we see in countries around the world. Yesterday, a group of workers in Michigan filed a suit alleging that their H-2 sponsor in the United States, when they had complained about their working conditions, took them, they thought, on a shopping trip, but actually were taking them to turn them over to immigration enforcement. This is happening in the United States. It happens around the world. Anytime we have situations where the immigration status is tied to the employer. Because of the wealth that ended up happening in the Gulf, we ended up seeing a real varied migrant experience with different national responses, different distinctions in job categories, but very much in service of a urbanization and a building spree, for lack of a better word. And so I think a lot of folks in the rest of the world have seen the Gulf as a place where you have mega construction projects, where you end up having thousands and thousands of foreign migrant workers who are being held in large man camps and dying because of the heat in the middle of the day. All true, but I think, as you'll hear hopefully from our panelists, that is not the full picture. Foreign guest workers can be found in almost every sector of the Gulf, from medicine to hospitality, finance to retail, even in government. Many of the people who one will meet with in those government offices are Nepalis, are Jordanians, are Egyptians. So there's a lot of cross currents, and there's estimates that up to 85% of the population and workforce in some of these countries is actually foreign. So it's not simply the large numbers of construction workers on those mega projects. One of the things that we've seen, though, is that the exposure of fractures in economies and in cultures that COVID-19 allows us to see more clearly. And I think that that's one of the things that we'll hopefully be hearing about from the panel. Elizabeth France and some colleagues from Humanity United, which is another leading organization in this, have been so good as to bring people together to confront a lot of this over the last few months. And that's certainly been a learning experience for me as we hear about kind of what are the both best and worst practices in the Gulf dealing with COVID-19 and its fallout. I want to end with this. The focus on the Gulf today and the focus on COVID-19, I think, give us a good way to look at something that has been going on for a long time and not just in this place in the world. But it is so starkly drawn and it is so sharply drawn in the Gulf that it is, I think, drawn attention of advocates, of other governments, of the governments of these particular countries themselves. And you'll see on this map in front of you these different colors. These are the colors of the tier rankings in the United States Trafficking in Persons report that came out yesterday, where you see that Bahrain, as a little green dot there on the map, is seen as complying with the minimum standards to combat trafficking in persons. The other countries, red is the worst, orange is not doing very well at all, and yellow is kind of muddling along. This is very different than we would have seen even 10 years ago, when almost all of the countries in the Gulf were on the worst offender lists. There's been a lot of activity from both NGOs and government, and even multinational or multilateral international organizations such as the UN and the ILO. And I think that it's one of the things that we'll hopefully be seeing today is not just a litany of the horrors facing a foreign worker in this part of the country, in this part of the world, but actually some of the best practices and some of the things that have been done to try to confront that. So I'm very much looking forward to that, and I think we're going to move straight in to Dr. France, who can hopefully take us down a little bit more granular than my little flyover.
Thank you, Lou. Hi, good morning, everyone. Good afternoon. So I'll start with a few facts and figures just to set the stage, adding to what Lou said in the overview. The Arab region hosts the world's largest share of migrant workers as a proportion of the total workforce. So across the Arab states, they make up 40% of the workforce. This compares, for example, to 20% in North America or 17% in Europe. In some of the Gulf states, of course, that proportion is even higher. They make up 80% of the population in Qatar and the UAE. Most of these workers come from Asia, with sizable numbers also coming from Africa, particularly Egypt, and increasingly also from East Africa. They're heavily concentrated in the construction and hospitality sectors, as well as in domestic work. Roughly 40% of all migrant workers in the region are women, and 61% of those are in domestic work. The academic literature, as well as the human rights reporting that has happened over the last decade, has shown that labor exploitation by migrant workers continues to be widespread in the region. Though there are difficulties for all migrants, migrant domestic workers who are excluded from the labor law are perhaps the most vulnerable to abuse and exploitation. The crux of the problem, as Lou noted in his opening, lies in the sponsorship system. Migrants are employed on guest worker programs in which they're sponsored by a specific employer to work on a short-term contract, usually for 2 or 3 years. Their visas are tied to their employers, which means they can't effectively leave a bad job for a better one, and they're reluctant to complain about abuse, not least because it could result in detention and jeopardize their right to stay in the country. As Lou said, there's a tendency to talk about the Gulf and the sponsorship system in ways that make it seem uniquely awful and exotic, but it is important to recognize that the power inequality between workers and employers that the sponsorship system sets up is something we see in other parts of the world as well, including in the United States with its visa-based temporary migrant worker programs. In the Arab region, migrants, especially in low-wage jobs, have no path to permanent immigrant status or naturalization in the destination countries. And as a result, their temporary status denies them the chance to remain or integrate. Another pervasive problem, which you'll hear more about from the next speaker, Fabienne, and I'll mention just briefly here, relates to recruitment. In the Asia Middle East corridor, about 80% of all migrants are thought to rely on recruitment agencies or other middlemen to find jobs abroad. For highly paid migrants, such as academics, employers tend to pay all the recruitment costs. But for those taking up low-wage jobs, they typically are forced to pay exorbitant charges for recruitment. So for example, a Bangladeshi migrant heading to work in Saudi Arabia might pay recruitment costs totaling half the wages that he might earn under a 3-year contract. Many migrants work for 6 months or even up to a year just to pay back those fees, which sets the stage for debt bondage. These problems in recruitment are systematic, not sporadic, and you'll hear more about that as well as ways out of the situation from Fabienne. I'll end on the fact that there has been progress made. 10 years ago, when I started doing work in the Gulf, there were very few trade unions active in the Gulf. There was very little awareness of migrant workers' rights. And with the Arab Spring kicking off, there was a general fear that giving more rights to anyone, including migrants, could simply heighten the political contestations. But this has changed, and Qatar has been the focus of a lot of it because since 2010, when it won the bid to host the 2022 World Cup, it has attracted a huge amount of international attention. And that has helped catapult the migrant worker issue onto policy agendas and into the media headlines in a way that it hadn't been before. And so in terms of concrete policy reforms, I'll point to a couple examples from Qatar because I know that best, and it's also received the most attention. But I will say that there have been notable reforms in other Gulf states as well. So one thing in particular is a new minimum wage law that's been introduced that applies to all nationalities. That's the first in the region. Another is that migrant workers typically have to obtain their employer's consent before changing jobs or leaving the country, which opens them up to abuse. And the requirement to have an employer's permission to leave the country has now been lifted for most workers in Qatar, though not domestic workers. This is an important step forward, and I'd say it now needs to be extended to include domestic workers as well. And last, there have been steps to establish labor committees at companies employing more than 30 workers to enable the beginnings of a collective bargaining system. This is the beginnings of an industrial relations system. In many of the Gulf states, with the exceptions of Bahrain and Kuwait, trade unions have not been formally allowed. Freedom of association hasn't been recognized. But I think in Qatar, the creation of these labor committees is an important step towards allowing union-like organizations to function. The progress shouldn't be overstated. There's still a huge amount to be done. And we know from human rights reporting and reporting from groups on the ground that there are still widespread problems. But I think if these reforms will be implemented in the coming years, it really could be game-changing. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. And I think we're going to go all the way to California for Matt, who's going to give us a little bit of the historical context in what labor migration and forced migration in the form of slavery historically looked like in the kind of formative years of these, what weren't necessarily states at all, the way we think of them. Matt, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Lou. And Daniel, if we could show some of the slides. I wanted to open with a quick story that takes us back to over 100 years ago. In October of 1907, the British paddle wheel steamer, the HMS Sphinx, was paddling off of the coast of Oman. And these 6 men swam over the course of 3 days off to this ship and climbed aboard, requesting British assistance and begging for their freedom. All 6 claimed to be enslaved and claimed to be working in the date industry in the Gulf. And you'll see that one of these men, the one on your far left, has a manacle around his left ankle. And Daniel, if you could show the next slide, you can see in the next image that the manacle was then sawed off and then dramatically photographed on behalf of the captain of the ship. And then if you could show the next slide, Daniel, here's a map of the region. You can see the Batna region in the lower right-hand corner. And these men all profess to have been abused or threatened with sale, and all experienced enslavement, and by their accounts were abused and working under really horrendous conditions in the date industry. And I think stories like theirs invite us to reflect on another period in which, or another moment in history in which global demand for commodities produce demand for labor. So these days we're talking about global markets for oil, which create demand and also the capability for drawing on labor from around the world. But there was another moment in which there were huge demands for labor, and this was in the 19th and early 20th century. Daniel, if you'd show the next slide, this is a shameless plug for a book on this subject, so I only have time to spend just a few minutes summarizing what I talk about in more detail in the book. But there are 2 key commodities that expand massively in the course of the 19th century that create demand for labor in the Gulf. And we have to remember, Daniel, if you'd show the next slides 5 through 10, we'll just, you could just advance these sequentially over the next 2 minutes. The date industry was the first of the industries to become truly global in the Gulf. Dates in the Gulf formerly fed regional markets centered on the Gulf itself, Arabia and India. But the United States became the best foreign customer for dates from the Gulf. And the United States began to import massive amounts of a particular variety of Gulf that was grown in Oman that ripened early enough for ships to make the 100-day journey back to the United States and sell them in time for the holidays. So American grocers and merchants would sell dates from Arabia. And they became incredibly popular in the United States. But as that formerly regional commodity became globalized, so too did demand for labor massively expand. And there was a second commodity, even more lucrative. And Daniel, if you could show the next slides. Oh, sorry, I should highlight that the main method for irrigation used in the Vatana region was this. This is this is known as the Zijra well. This is sort of used to irrigate date palms, and a lot of the labor that was required to massively expand the date industry was driven by the demand for irrigation. And so this requires both animal and human labor to irrigate the date palms. I think if you can show the next slide, Daniel. And there was also other work that was required to pollinate the date palms, also to harvest them, and then ultimately to pack them for shipping. But there was a second commodity that was even more lucrative than dates, and that was pearls. We don't often think about this, but all of those pictures you see from the late 19th, especially early 20th century, of women wearing these fashionable pearl necklaces, we don't think very often about how those pearls were produced, but about at least half of the value of global pearls was produced in the Gulf. And much of the labor involved very coercive conditions and very often involved slave labor. And so Daniel, if you could show the next 6 slides, you can sort of advance these sequentially. The fashionable women of the late 19th and early 20th century wore pearl necklaces probably without thinking very much about who was diving for the pearls. We don't have any precise estimates, but foreign observers in the region at the time estimated anywhere between 1/4 and 1/2 of the divers were of African ancestry, and many of them enslaved. And these pearls became incredibly fashionable and incredibly valuable, and this created new demands for labor. Much of it met from enslaved labor from Africa. So you'll see some statistics on a later slide, but just to give you an idea, in Bahrain alone, the massive expansion at the turn of the 20th century, something in the neighborhood of 800% in value over the course of just a few short years. The labor conditions were incredibly grueling. They involved partners, divers and pullers working in tandem, and many of these people had been enslaved as children in Africa and brought to the Gulf and sent out to diving when they reached their early teens. And Daniel, if you'd show the next image, I think you'll see. So the massive expansion of the pearling industry also created demand for labor. And these two industries, in a sense, working in tandem and side by side, continued to expand into the early 20th century. And as they expanded, the relatively small populations of the Gulf were really strained for labor. And if you think about the archaeology of the region, one of the leading archaeologists of the Gulf, Robert Carter, has argued that really before the 18th century, most of what are today the Gulf states on the western side of the Gulf were really non-existent, not even really part-time camps, with the exception of Ras Al Khaimah and Bahrain. For the most part, the eastern side of Arabia, from Hormuz all the way up to Kuwait, was really essentially uninhabited or only partially inhabited for part of the year. What enabled, in his words, Arab settlers in the region to override environmental constraints on permanent settlement was a decline of the Safavid Empire's control over the pearling industry and the ability of people in the region to finally escape that environmental constraint and begin to create habitations that could be more permanent. So if you've seen images from even the late 19th century, the Gulf states as we know them now were really just coming into being. And so the relatively small populations in the region And the demand, the global demand for these two commodities helped drive demand for labor. And much of this was met with servile labor, slave labor, from East Africa in particular, and then in the early 20th century also from Baluchistan. And then Daniel, if you could show the next couple of slides. What ends up happening in the early 20th century is that California begins to produce dates of its own, and that really undercuts the Gulf's corner on global date markets. And almost simultaneously, Mikimoto in Japan begins to produce cultured pearls. Daniel, the next two slides I think will help illustrate that, using primarily industrial labor in Japan to mass produce cultured pearls. And these two industries, the date industry and the pearling industry, collapse more or less in tandem around the time of the Great Depression. And then shortly after that, there'll be a transition to oil production in the Gulf. So Daniel, if you could show just the next slide here. I want to just reflect in the minute or two remaining about some reflections as a historian making connections or trying to make comparisons between modern slavery and the kinds of labor conditions we saw in the 19th century. And I think perhaps my best intervention that I could make would be some cautionary notes. So the first would be that we should take care with our definitions and recognize that there are some distinct differences between modern slavery and historical slavery. So Joel Quirk in 2012 entry in the Routledge Encyclopedia of Slavery identifies 6 core practices of modern slavery. So classical slavery, forced prostitution, forced labor, bonded labor, exploitation of domestic workers, and wartime enslavement. And in the Gulf, about half of these we would not consider to be factors. The other half, I think, would be. But it's important to point out that there are some real differences between modern slavery and historical slavery in the Gulf with respect to procurement, where people are coming from. For the most part in the 19th century, the leading cause of enslavement was kidnapping, war, and people who were enslaved in East Africa being then sold to the Gulf. In terms of the treatment of workers in the 19th century, enslaved Africans experienced very high degrees of the use and threat of physical violence as well as terror. And then, both of the two key definitions of slavery, both the Orlando Patterson emphasis on natal alienation and the League of Nations definition of the exercise of the right of ownership, were very much true of 19th century enslaved Africans, in ways that we should reflect on, I think, as we use these two terms and honor, I think, the legacy or the memory of those people who experienced enslavement in the 19th century, alongside honoring the experiences of exploited workers in the 21st century. The next caveats I would just highlight, Daniel, if you could show the last slide here. I would say recognize that the Gulf region, has already been mentioned, is not unique. Coercive labor practices are global phenomena, and that tend to accompany the spread of capitalism through globalization, and that the Indian Ocean in many ways mirrors the Atlantic of a century earlier, that global markets for things like sugar in the Atlantic helped drive the transatlantic slave trade. Similarly, global markets for these commodities that are produced in the Gulf also helped to drive demand for enslaved labor in the Gulf in the 19th century. And then finally, we should be wary of, or we should be aware of and acknowledge the paradoxes of historical humanitarian interventions. That certainly, if we look at the example of the 19th century anti-slave trade campaign by the British Royal Navy in the Indian Ocean, we find abolitionists who are very well intentioned, but who very often hadn't thought through the ramifications of their actions. And so very large slave ships were captured in the Indian Ocean just as they were in the Atlantic. Very large numbers of captives were captured on the high seas, but they were never freed. They were never just sent ashore and left to their own devices. They were always taken to a British port and indentured for 4 to 14 years. And the mortality rates on these Royal Navy vessels sometimes were astronomically high, as high as 50% or higher in some cases. In some cases, ships being towed to these British ports were lost at sea. And the labor conditions for people who were among this category of we call liberated Africans, these are people who were taken off of slave ships, very often mirrored slavery in many ways. And so I think it's important for us to be also sort of reflective on the paradoxes of these earlier humanitarian interventions, and in some ways maybe take some lessons from them. I think the last image, Daniel, is one of these groups from the 1860s aboard one of these ships in the Western Indian Ocean. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Matt. And I think if we can bring Fabian up as well. You know, it's fascinating when you really start delving down into this, because you start to see that the parallels were, while not exact, and the legal definitions of slavery and enslavement and forced labor and all of these things might be different, that when you start interrogating kind of the lived experiences of the workers, it can really shine a light on that. And Fabian, you've certainly done that over the last years of your career, and really have been able to make that connection to the workers who, as far as I can tell, are not being kidnapped, but are very much hoping for a better life with this type of an opportunity. Fabian?
Thanks very much, Lou, and thanks to the previous panelists for the great introductions and context. I'll just pick up exactly where Lou just mentioned. You talk about trying to make a better life. The one story which runs through all of these, across all of the corridors that we're looking at in this project, is the dream of essentially being able to, through a migration process, improve your life. And what we're looking at in this project is trying to understand where that dream kind of can fall apart and how we can better facilitate it as well. As Elizabeth mentioned, there's been a lot of attention on the topic of slavery. This particular project focused on recruitment process. I'll just highlight, though, that it's not unique to the GCCs. We are actually looking at 5 different migration corridors. They include Myanmar to Thailand, Nepal to Qatar, Nepal to Kuwait, the Philippines to Taiwan, and also Mexico to Canada. I personally am particularly focusing on the Nepal to Qatar and Kuwait previous body of work on researching labour rights issues in the GCC. And I'll therefore be drawing on those particular corridors in particular. But as has been stressed, we are looking at how recruitment-related abuses occur in various different migration systems and in different regions as well. I wanted to start just by drawing attention to this picture, and I should give credit to Dr. Angela Sherwood at the University of Oxford, who actually took this picture. The reason why I wanted to just speak a bit about this picture is because, for me, it actually captures a lot of the challenges and the issues that we're trying to address with the 5 Corridors project. So if I'll draw your attention first to the hats that these men are wearing. They actually, I'm interested in what different people see when they look at this picture. And for me, when I see those hats, I can immediately see that this is a system, and also that it's laid with informality. The reason being that the different color-coded hats that you see are actually determinants for when these migrants who are actually about to board flights from Kathmandu, the central airport in Kathmandu, to the GCC, those hats are determinants so that their employer on the other side can identify them. Also, if you look in their hands, a lot of the migrants are carrying papers. Some are actually looking at them. Those may well be contracts which they may have just been handed as they're about to depart and board the flights. They may have only just seen or received new terms of employment, which may differ from what they were told earlier, or may be the first time that they've seen these documents. The other thing I find interesting about this picture is when you see a flight, people departing on a flight, you think of the start of the journey, but I'd stress that this really isn't in terms of the recruitment process. The migrants that you see waiting to board these flights have actually been through different processes and potentially quite lengthy processes as well. In terms of traveling from rural locations, this process may have taken weeks or months. and they've also already been through various different licensing, recruitment, potentially informal channels, and also, as Elizabeth stressed earlier, have most likely incurred a significant debt already at this stage. So the reason why that's interesting is that their exploitation, or their risk of exploitation, has kind of already started before their migration flight necessarily has. So this picture kind of captures a lot of the challenges that we're trying to address, because while we can infer that these migrants have probably paid fees already before they even depart to their destination. They've probably paid those fees to recruitment agents, as Elizabeth mentioned. But those recruitment agents are more often than not selling visas which have been approved in some format from the GCC. They're selling visas which may be attached to an employer in the GCC, which may be a state-owned organization or company, most likely, and very often with an international partner as well. So if we've already mentioned the prevalence of construction in driving migration to the GCC. And so lots of international, North American and European, and also South Asian construction conglomerates, construction and engineering firms will be the kind of part of the endpoint of this journey. So you can already see in this picture that there is already a distribution of responsibility. There's a layer of potential risks, and there's some of the challenges that we're trying to address. Just before we move to the next slide, as I mentioned, these migrants have already been through some element of a regulatory framework which has been established by the Nepalese authorities, and also which touches some frameworks from the destination countries as well. So this is the challenge that we're trying to address. And Daniel, if we could move to the next slide, please. So in terms of understanding the goal, I'd also just highlight that, as was said in the first presentation, there has been a lot of attention on this topic, this issue, over the past 10 years, largely driven by the media attention around the Qatar 2022 World Cup, and also the establishment of educational facilities by North American institutions in other areas of the GCC, such as the UAE. But a lot of the focus, a lot of the initiative that we've seen around addressing this issue of potentially abusive recruitment actually has focused on the private sector. We've seen a lot of initiatives, and I'll be able to draw on that on, later in the session, but a lot of initiative has actually either come from the private sector, or you've seen partnerships between civil society and the private sector to try to develop guidance for companies to have more kind of fair recruitment processes, and to exclude the payment of fees, for example, or the challenge of contract substitution, whereby migrant workers, as I referred to in the image, receive a new set of terms and conditions that they haven't agreed to. So one thing we want to look at with this issue is, what can governments be doing? There are extensive regulatory frameworks. They operate differently. Even within the GCC, I would stress that they do operate in different, they are set up differently, they operate differently. And so we want to try to understand, as Lou was saying, like, what is best practice? And I think in terms of full disclosure, I think we're coming at this from the position that this issue is not intractable, which is something we've sometimes felt is something that's come out, that companies, governments, while they will take different kind of initiatives around this topic, that there's almost an expectation that this is a fact and a reality, and unavoidable, essentially, that migrants will arrive in the GCC laden with debt, and therefore at a heightened risk of abuse. And to be able to identify that best practice and to understand how governments can better perform on this topic, and how they can actually galvanize processes of fair recruitment, we want to understand what those metrics are. How can we actually measure performance by governments on this topic? And that's very much what, and also try to understand which metrics drive positive outcomes for workers. And the reason why that's an important dynamic of this is because, at least in the the research that I've been involved in, for example, when I was at Amnesty International, it's a fairly strong correlation that the greater level of death incurred in the migration process, the more likely and higher risk of abuse in the destination country as well, because the vulnerability and the agency, the vulnerability increases and the agency for migrant working reduces in that process. Daniel, if we can move to the next slide, please. Both Lou and Elizabeth did mention that we are building on a body of work that already has gone into this, as well as private sector initiatives around ethical recruitment guidance. I would also just say there's been a decent body of academic and research, and also human rights documentation of abuse in the processes as well. So, for example, a lot of anthropologists such as Andrew Gardner or Zahra Babar at Georgetown campus in Doha have done a lot of work on this topic. Human rights organizations have documented a lot of the abuses in the recruitment and employment process as well. And then also international organizations such as the IOM and ILO have this has been a significant priority for their work, especially the work of Catherine Jones with the IOM and IOM's specific process of what's known as IRIS, which is an ethical recruitment certification process, whereby people involved in the recruitment process can essentially go on a learning process with the IOM to try to improve their practices and encourage ethical recruitment in their industry. I just wanted to highlight that background of body of work because to also stress what we're looking at for this. Essentially, our focus is very much on implementation. There's increasingly a lot of, as I said, private sector and also international guidance and very technical guidance. But we see different outcomes in how governments apply them and in the treatment of workers. So these are so we want to understand what are what differences in application drive different outcomes for workers. So just briefly on this slide, if you look at least on my side, it's the left, so the 9 policy areas. These are actually drawn or largely drawn from the ILO's general principles for fair recruitment, which are a non-binding set of international standards which the ILO has developed for governments, employers and labour recruiters on how they can operate fair recruitment standards. We have actually, and these are essentially the 9 kind of areas which we're looking at in terms of how both countries of origin and countries of destination approach the topic of regulating recruitment in migration corridors. They are broken down in greater detail, but I won't include them here. But they do also, we have also included some dynamics that we think are potential metrics which should be tested in understanding how governments perform on this issue. So, for example, around national migration policy, one of the key elements of that is gender factored into the country's national migration policy. Also, we think that corruption is a significant factor as well, often in both ends potentially of the migration process, and how governments address the issue of corruption in the context of recruitment is another metric that we think is important. I won't go through all 9 of these policy areas that we're assessing, but what I will just draw attention to as well is that we are also building on the work of the Institute for Human Rights and Business and their responsible leadership group for responsible recruitment, who developed this set of what are known as the DACA principles for migration with dignity. And this is kind of the standard which we are applying as a kind of base level of the sort of treatments migrants should expect in their migration process to have an understanding of, or to have some reality of migrating with a sense of dignity. So these are, I would say, like kind of base standards that we're applying, and we're trying to understand essentially, if you consider the inputs of the steps which governments may or may not be taking around the 9 policy areas which are highlighted, and how they feed into or drive an experience of migration which meets those standards, minimum standards, on displayed on the flip side of that slide. So those are kind of the key foundations of the body of research which we're currently undertaking. And Daniel, if we could just move to the last slide as well. Thank you. So just to confirm again, these are the corridors that we are focusing. I won't. This is a body of research which is ongoing, so I won't draw definitive conclusions. But one thing, I did want to just kind of highlight some of the observations which are coming across. So we have very different migration corridors, different regulation frameworks across these 5 corridors, and also even within the GCC, as I mentioned, between in terms of how Kuwait and how Qatar operate their migration processes, or recruitment processes. One other process which is currently of significant relevance that IOM has recently developed, what they're calling Montreal recommendations, where they brought different states together to also have a discussion about recruitment regulation. And some of the findings from that process are a consistent challenge, I think, across all of these corridors where recruitment-related abuses do continue, is transparency. This is largely, a lot of these processes, despite having established regulatory frameworks in place, operate informally. And that doesn't mean necessarily there's the absence of regulation. It just is, as we were kind of stressing, the implementation is often lacking. And actually, just to return to the, if I can bring your minds back to the first picture, the image of the men waiting to board a plane. The other observation I wanted to make about that image is, where are the women? As Elizabeth stressed, migration to the GCC, a significant proportion of migration to the GCC is women working as domestic workers in households across the region. There's very high demand for women to be migrated to work is in the homes of GCC nationals. And the fact of them not being in that image also tells the story, I think, in that there's a significant degree of invisibility essentially around not just the employment conditions which women work in the domestic sector endure, but also around their migration recruitment experience, which is often highly informal. So just to draw very quickly on, for example, Nepal to Kuwait. Kuwait was actually the first country in the GCC to pass a specific law to go some way to addressing the gap in legislation that Elizabeth referred to earlier, in that domestic workers are usually excluded from labour protections. Kuwait in 2015 did pass a law with specific domestic worker protections. But what we see is that actually the existence, a lot of the dynamics are very corridor specific. So a Filipina domestic worker may have a very different experience to a Nepali domestic worker in Kuwait because of the level or lack of interaction between the various governments. So I think it's fair to say that the Nepal corridor is arguably less of a priority for the Kuwaiti government, because there is not a memorandum of understanding, whereas between Nepal and Qatar, there is a bilateral agreement which has existed since 2005. And Nepal has also actually banned its women from migrating to Kuwait to work as domestic workers, but that migration persists via transit countries. Nepal shares a land border with India, and that is a mode by which Nepali women continue to migrate to be employed in Kuwait, and there's a clear disconnect between how because there is arguably less of a element of coordination between the sending country governments on that particular phenomenon of migration. What you then find is that Nepali women are kind of invisible to both both governments involved in that. To the Kuwaiti authorities, they are undocumented migrants more often than not. It's well aware that the phenomenon continues, and more often than not, those women are considered to have gone via because they have taken informal routes, that they are therefore, I would say they're less at the, they're not often the priority for assistance when they end up in difficult situations. I think I'm at time, so I'll draw to a close at this point so we can move the discussion on. But thank you for the opportunity to introduce you to this body of work.
Thank you, Fabienne. We're going to do some moderator-led question and answers. Then I'll start, and then we'll go back and forth between me and Kate. So if all of our panelists, Elizabeth, Fabienne, and Matt, if you can join us on screen, that would be great. Elizabeth, how is COVID-19 changing all of these things? We've kind of got a baseline now of, kind of what is the Gulf, what's going on in the Gulf, how does this all work? And then suddenly a few months ago, it seems like a totally new factor comes into play. What have you been seeing, and what have the folks that you've been helping coordinate the discussions with, what have they been seeing?
Thanks, Lou. I think the COVID-19 crisis has magnified the structural problems in labor migration governance in the region, namely the operation of the sponsorship system and the lack of workers' voice in the region. These problems are not new. They've been around for a long time, a very long time, as Matt pointed out, but they've been exacerbated for migrant workers in the context of the pandemic, where they're suffering income losses, wage theft. The fiscal packages haven't really addressed migrant workers in a significant way. One facet that's been exacerbated is around the overcrowded accommodation. Many migrant workers in the region, especially in the construction sector and some of the manufacturing and cleaning sectors, live in labor camps in satellite areas outside of the cities. And their crowding and unhygienic conditions have been longstanding problems. And it seems that the majority of the people across the region who have contracted the virus are migrants, no doubt in part because of these overcrowded living conditions, which make social distancing very difficult. We also know that women migrants are disproportionately affected by the crisis because they're overrepresented in frontline sectors such as healthcare and domestic work. Many of them already were earning low wages and had poor working conditions, but we're hearing from groups on the ground that there are spikes in complaints of abuse. And we know this is true in many parts of the world, but the confinement measures have led to an increase in domestic violence against women migrants. I'd also say, we're on the cusp of an economic depression that may be 3 times what it was in the 30s. And we know that in economic downturns, migrants tend to be the first laid off. And this situation is no different. We're heading into a period where there will probably be falling demand for migrant workers in the region, at least for a while. And the loss of income from layoffs and work slowdowns is already resulting in a slowdown in remittances. The World Bank is predicting that global remittances will plunge by 20% in 2020, which would be the sharpest decline in history. And migrant worker groups and unions that we work with are already reporting increasing layoffs and worsening working conditions. Last, if I might, I would point to the issue of repatriations. Since the start of the pandemic, 200,000 migrants have been repatriated to Asian states alone. In the Gulf, there is anecdotal evidence that this is happening without adequate testing beforehand, in processes where often migrant workers themselves have to pay the costs for repatriation, and where there isn't any due process for migrant workers who may be owed wages by their employers, and so no options for legal recourse before they're sent back. And we know that in some instances, employers are using this as an excuse not to pay wages. Given the scale of migrants who could be repatriated in the coming months, one human rights lawyer described this as possibly the largest collective case of wage theft in recent history. We're hearing about this from groups on the ground. As far as I know, no one is tracking this systematically, which I think is a real gap. There is a coalition of NGOs and trade unions that are calling for an urgent justice mechanism to address this. but it's something that I think warrants further attention. A long-standing problem, wage theft, which is worse, getting worse in the context of the pandemic.
Thanks, Elizabeth. I want to turn this question to Fabian. You know, one of the things that when we think about building back after building back free or building back in a different way, you know, it strikes me as you were talking, there's just so many different actors involved and so many places to perhaps, you know, nodes of intervention. You've got a lot of, you know, new standards. You've got these memorandums of understanding between sending and receiving governments. You have the role of the labor merchants who are that intermediary connecting the supply to the demand. You have the migrants who are quite motivated because there is, even with 50% fees, potentially the possibility of earning, you know, I've read 4 to 5 times as much in through this by migrating versus staying at home. And then you have international organizations, civil society, and the employers themselves. So I just wondered if you could reflect on what your thoughts are about, or what you've learned so far about where are those nodes for quick wins of intervention, what seems to be effective, you know, with the memorandums of understanding, something like wage theft, who's responsible, you know, could be arranged, but are you finding that in making their way into those kind of memorandums of understanding? Say more about all, you know, the labor merchants. You might have a lot of, in one corridor you might have, is there a lot of variation between corridors where you have a lot of small family merchants versus large consolidated structures? Would love to hear more about that.
Sure. Yeah, there is significant variation, definitely, in terms of, and as well as new standards. There's been a lot of initiative, I think, to try to identify those nodes and to regulate them better. You mentioned the labor merchants, and they're often a specific kind of focus. They're a very key focus of this particular research. They do exist in different contexts. So, for example, in Canada, certain classed as consultants, but seem to play a very similar kind of role to some of the recruitment agents, for example, in the South Asian to GCC migration corridors. I think in terms of, Elizabeth really kind of captured it. I think that there's significant risk at this stage. And one of the, I think, I don't know if it's a node so much, but prioritization is a real kind of key. I think we've heard in our research, one thing that has kind of struck us is, you know, Nepal contributes, so migrants contribute, I think, at least a quarter of Nepal's GDP through remittances. And but yet a lot of kind of civil society organizations feel that actually Nepali migrants are not considered kind of key, are not priorities on the agenda, essentially. And so that asks the question, what are the priorities? And I think that shapes the how the merchants operate. So, for example, in Nepal, if you look at the different actors, the government has in 2015 introduced a policy which is called the free visa, free ticket policy, which was essentially meant to reduce but not eliminate, or set a legal cap on the fees which Nepali migrant workers were allowed to pay. So that is a difference from, for example, other corridors, such as, for example, Philippines has, I think, outright banned, said that recruitment fees are not legal, whereas Nepal has introduced what should be a lower cap. And if you want to look at the kind of dynamics and the different challenges ahead, I think that the response of the recruitment industry, which is a powerful player in this issue. So, for example, there's a trade association known as NAFIA, which represents the kind of key licensed private recruitment actors based in Kathmandu, and they effectively went on strike. They had raised quite significant opposition to that policy, and I think that that's across all of, as this potential crisis unfolds, I think across all of the different actors involved, the government, the various industries, what we'll need to kind of prioritize is actually putting migrants at the top of the agenda. The context of Nepal specifically, again, the Supreme Court had to issue a ruling recently to actually ask the government to prioritize Nepali migrants who are stuck overseas in crisis, losing their jobs. And so I think that's something which is coming through across all of the corridors, really, that each of the countries chosen have shown some willingness to actually address the issue of fair recruitment in different ways and with different regulation. And a lot of that has come through technical partnership with the great work that a lot of the international organizations such as ILO and IOM do. But what we're noticing is where those gaps emerge is where there's clearly migrants actually aren't high enough in the agenda. And so for the resourcing of these actual programs and these initiatives to try to reduce fees, to try to regulate the operations of those labour merchants and to try to bring them actually into the regulatory framework. Again, just in Nepal, you have the Kathmandu-based, large, fairly powerful recruitment agents, but they are reliant on networks of brokers at a regional level and also on a village level, and in terms of who they may or may not be. Very often they may be an extended family member of the migrant or someone prominent in the village who Nepal has tried to bring them into the system essentially by asking or allowing licensed recruitment agents to form legal partnerships with 10 sub-agents. But what we've seen, because there was a fee attached to that, it kind of hasn't really realized. And so you see that kind of, if migrants were really were kind of the center of that approach, I think that kind of obstacle to regulating those intermediaries would not have been missed.
Yeah.
So it's interesting because I think that what we see is the status of some of these labor recruiters and some of these labor brokers can be very high status. The Kuwaitis, I think, surprised everybody a couple of weeks ago when they arrested 2 members of the Bangladeshi parliament who live in Kuwait. I guess they don't go to parliament very often. But their company had brought in, I think, more than 20,000 Bangladeshi workers over the last few years. They and their business partner were just arrested for human trafficking as well as corruption. There was an awful lot of Mercedeses being bought for mid-level Kuwaiti government employees by these parliamentarians. And I guess to me that begs the question of kind of how are the people operating, whether it's now or then. And Matt, we talk about kind of slavery in the basin, or we talk about the interdiction by the British, but who are the slavers in the 19th century? Are these kind of factors on the East African Zanzibar type of things like we think about from the 1400s, or are these something that looks a little bit more like these labor recruiters that we see now? Kind of who were the people who were bringing in that captive workforce back when we were talking about dates and pearls?
Yeah, thanks. There's there's a very interesting and good book by Hideaki Suzuki on this subject. It's very recent, I think, and timely. For the most part, what's an often, I think, overlooked aspect of the Indian Ocean slave trade, that in at least the massive expansion that takes place in the 19th century is largely a byproduct of the transatlantic slave trade. So it's actually measures put into place to supply demand in places like Cuba and Brazil by slave traders, trading, flying Portuguese and Spanish flags. That's put into place in places like Mozambique in order to supply the transatlantic slave trade. And it's really British intervention after 1807 that Abdul Sharif has done, I think has argued really effectively in his book, Slave Spices and Ivory in Zanzibar, that the real increase in slave trading to Arabia, but also to the East African coast, picks up as the British begin to patrol the coasts for slave ships, and that inspires local producers to use enslaved African labor on the East African coast in places like Zanzibar, but also in the Gulf. As far as coming to the Gulf, we don't have the precise kind of granular level data that would help us make any kind of sweeping claims. But I can tell you, based on the evidence I've seen, most of the ships came into the port city of Sur, which is in the easternmost portion of the Arabian Peninsula in what's today Oman. And then some of them, some ships also went directly to the Batna coast. Earlier in the 19th century and certainly in the 18th century, ships went directly into Muscat, but that's largely not the case by the middle of the 19th century, where they're going to Sur. Even through the early 20th century, ships continue to arrive at that port city. And then in smaller groups, people are transported to the Batna coast, which is increasingly the center of date production in the Samail Valley, and then from there elsewhere in the Gulf. But it's not uncommon to find in the transcripts of enslaved Africans who are seeking manumission in the Gulf port cities like Manama in Bahrain, and in Sharjah in what's today the Emirates, to find people who are enslaved by or were trafficked by members of the royal family or leading merchants in some of these big cities. So, I think it's a diverse group. And from the correspondence I've seen, because in some of these ships when they're captured, the correspondence is preserved, both men and women are involved in requesting captives to be transported to Arabia. People of high status and middling status are involved, and people of a variety of different groups up and down the eastern coast of Arabia are involved in the trafficking of enslaved African labor to the Gulf.
I want to turn to Elizabeth now. Elizabeth, thinking both you and Lou have mentioned that, have cautioned us against thinking about the Gulf situation as unique, right? And so I just wondered if you could say more about that through your work at the Open Society Foundation on the International Migration Initiative. What are the ways in which the kind of labor migration regimes that we see in the Gulf are echoed in other regimes that you're familiar with, or what are elements that are perhaps we see more clearly in the Gulf, but that exist in other places? Certainly, the size of the reliance on the migrant workforce seems to be unique, and that might lend itself to more formal structures, but I'm just curious to hear your reflection on that.
Thanks, Kate.
Generalizability question. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Kate. It's a good question. I think as Lou and I both said, the structural features of the Gulf sponsorship system are not a million miles from those of guest worker programs around the world. And if you're interested, Daniel Acosta and Phil Martin did a really good report a couple of years ago that was published by the Economic Policy Institute. I can put the link in the chat, that talked about the Gulf's temporary migration system and compared this to other guest worker programs around the world, and outlined what really needs to change in these systems to create more fairness in ways that don't trample workers' rights. So there are definitely comparable elements and recommendations that I think hold true to the Gulf states as well as other governments, but there are also distinctive features. And one, as you said, is the huge extent to which the GCC states have labor forces that are so highly demographically imbalanced in favor of foreigners over locals. Non-nationals outnumber citizens by huge margins in most of the Gulf countries. And managing this is a complex challenge for governments throughout the region as they try and meet their own domestic labor requirements and balance the socio-political consequences of this. I also think there are facets of the Gulf context that create a perfect storm for labor exploitation. There are complex legal systems in these countries, but limited political will by governments to crack down on abusive behavior by employers, especially if those employers are politically powerful, which allows for impunity. And that's not distinctive to the region, but I think you see it to a degree that really sets the stage for abuse. Adding to that, the fact that institutions like the system of labor inspections are woefully inadequate. They're not developed to the standard that you would need to be able to ensure monitoring of working conditions. And I know this is something that the ILO in particular has been working with Gulf states on. But this, combined with facets like barring migrants from leaving the country without permission from their employer, really make the power relations very unequal with employers. And lastly, again, this isn't unique to the region, but I think when you bring all these factors together, it leads to the perfect storm, is the fact that racism and discrimination and the devaluing of work that women do really compound the problems, especially for domestic workers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I somehow turned off my video instead of turning off my mute. I think in the interest of time, we've I think just got enough time for maybe two more quick questions of the panel, and then I think going into the commentary. Fabian, you and Matt, I think both have experienced the Qatari Museum that actually not only deals with the legacies of slavery in the region, but also has, at least when they opened, we're tying that together with some of the things that are happening right now. And I'd love to get both of yours quick thoughts on kind of what that museum is like. Maybe Matt, actually, if you can walk us through that, because I think you might have been involved with some of the preliminary discussions around creating the museum in the first place.
So I attended a conference in February of this year, just before the coronavirus epidemic shut down a lot of international transportation, and I was able to see the museum for the first time. But I actually consulted on it in very early stages, and just so people who are listening know, Qatar has put together a museum that's part of the Musharraf Heritage Quarter that is dedicated to the issue of slavery, both in the region and in Qatar in particular, because the house that they've converted into the museum was actually the house that was used by a slave trader. They've also dedicated a certain portion of the museum to contemporary issues of modern slavery and human trafficking. And so I had a chance to see it, and I have to say I'm really pleased. When they first approached me to consult on it, I initially was reluctant because I thought, on one hand, that the issue is a sensitive one, and it's controversial enough that the museum, in spite of all the best efforts, might not actually open. But in fact, it's open. I think much of it is really, really well done. And I think it just really reflects how one person really can make a difference. So Sheikha Musa, who really was the force behind this museum, has advocated strongly for it. And I encourage people to see it. I think it's well done. I think it encounters, it requires people to encounter their own complicity in modern day slavery by getting them to think about their own consumption. So I think in the 19th century, probably not a lot of people wearing pearl necklaces or eating dates were thinking about the slave production of those commodities. But how often today are we wearing clothes or talking or using electronics that were put together using materials that or even labor in the assembling of those things that was coercive or perhaps modern day slavery. And so in a sense, we can all do more reflecting on that, and the museum encourages us to do that and think about ways in which our own consumption patterns may even be contributing to modern slavery. Anyway, so I think there are rooms as you walk through, you encounter different aspects of slavery in the region, and then it puts it in the broader context of the global history of slavery. I'm pleased that the museum opened and that it's I think communicated that history so effectively.
I'll just reserve my final question for Fabian. I wanted to sort of pick up on this notion of the way in which, you know, consumers can pressure corporations to exercise more corporate social responsibility and reduce these kind of practices. I know you were involved with the Building Responsibly effort, which really tried to organize in the construction sector. Can you tell us a little bit about what you learned from that work? There's always, you know, the method of building the business case for doing things like reducing exploitive labor practices. And it's always curious to learn which part of that business case are more resonant, or how easy is it to get a whole sector of firms who are fiercely competing with each other to agree to these kind of initiatives. Love to hear your reflections on that. To kick off, then David and Andrew Crane talking about this topic more broadly.
Oh yeah, it's a really relevant contemporary context. I'll just quickly say that I also had the opportunity to visit the museum in Doha, and I think it was in 2017, after it perhaps just opened. And I too, you know, felt it was a meaningful engagement with the history and context of slavery, global slavery, and also in the region. I did learn a lot about the regional history by attending the museum, and it did also engage with the contemporary context as well. And I think that's actually an interesting kind of bridge, in that, you know, that's a new museum in Doha, which World Cup fans will visit. You know, this, as Matthew said, and as everyone, that all of us have acknowledged, this has been a particularly contentious issue in many ways. It's drawn a lot of kind of media attention, and so that engagement, that level of engagement that people who attend the World Cup, it's something that, as Matthew said, I think they should do, like, because it will help you understand the current context. And that brings me to the second part of the question, Kate, around business kind of leadership on this issue. So I was involved, I was working for BSR, which is a human rights, business and human rights consultancy, who were the secretariat for a private sector-led, construction sector-led initiative called Building Responsibly. That was a group of construction and engineering firms, I think initially perhaps just 5, who came together with the intention of trying to raise standards in their specific industry. I think there was a collective recognition that arguably the construction industry and engineering industry were behind, for example, even the garment industry and other industries which had already had a lot of focus and attention. So yeah, I think it's challenging to bring together you know, corporate rivals in many contexts, but there was the collective, you know, the spirit of the initiative was very much about collective action. And in many ways, I think that a lot of companies feel more comfortable working together to try to raise standards in the industry. A phrase that you often hear is about kind of first mover nerves. And so companies feel more comfortable working together essentially to try to address these issues. I would stress that there was civil society engagement as well, that I had first experience building responsibly as an Amnesty International researcher. So there was a willingness from the companies to draw on the expertise of migrant rights researchers, and there was definitely a desire to bring as many people in as possible. The steps that they took essentially were developing a set of principles, and I think that actually speaks to one of the biggest challenges that the companies or the sector saw, was that they operate in different regions with different particular labor-related challenges, and therefore the development of a set of principles which they felt could be applied in all those contexts, but then kind of drilled down in the different regional and country contexts, was kind of the approach that they wanted to take. I think one thing that was obvious is that once that base was agreed of a set of principles, drawing largely on existing international standards, then it's possible to see different organizations taking a different approach. Where does this issue sit within a business? Is it a human resources issue? Do you have a dedicated sustainability office, or is it a corporate relations? Does it sit in the corporate relations department? And that may determine a lot about how different companies actually engage with that process and how much innovation you see. Ethical recruitment has been at the forefront, I think, of a lot of the concerns of the companies operating in the GCC because of the media attention, because of the, I guess, corporate risk. And so again, it varies. Then companies kind of within the collective, in applying the kind of base standards that they collectively agreed, companies kind of can go forward and innovate to greater degrees. And you've seen some very interesting pilots in terms of collaborations with the ILO around kind of setting up a kind of single ethical recruitment chain, and that's produced valuable data which other stakeholders involved in this issue have been able to use and learn from and try to build on. So I would say that, yeah, the collective approach is often the most comfortable way that the companies feel about moving forward as first movers, that kind of first initial step. But you do see companies who are particularly dedicated then kind of partnering with experts to develop more specific, practical kind of practice on addressing, especially the issue of ethical recruitment.
Right, that's very interesting. So I'm going to turn it to David now, who will introduce our commentator. David, you're on mute still, so yeah.
All these new habits we have to develop. Sorry, I was on mute. It's a great pleasure to bring Andy Crane back to the GLC. By the way, I have to say here quickly, I can't wait to hear more about perhaps that museum. Maybe it will be off the session later. I've worked with a lot of American museums about issues of slavery and other things, and just how they pulled this off with success seems to me remarkable. I'd also like to hear about where things are with building for the World Cup, but maybe we can come back to that. But anyway, let me quickly introduce Andy. He is our commentator to tell us what all this means. Andrew Crane is professor of business and society and director of the Center for Business Organization and Society in the School of Management at the University of Bath in the United Kingdom. He's a leading author, commentator, researcher on all things corporate responsibility. Two of his books include the best-selling textbook, Business Ethics. Some people in the public audience might have come to believe that was an oxymoron. It is not in this field. And he's also the author of the Oxford Handbook of Corporate Social Responsibility. He writes about globalization and the economy. He writes about corporate citizenship. He writes about ethics and business. And I must say, he writes in lots of popular press, Financial Times, The Guardian, The Wall Street Journal, The Globe, The New York Times, and so forth. And Andy, I'm happy to say too, was a member of the GLC's Working Group on Modern Slavery, which met for more than 2 years and is about to publish a major book of essays, which will be out next fall, I believe, on modern slavery. So, Andy, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you for joining us. You're joining us from England as well. Welcome back.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation to be here. I mean, I'm not an expert on the Gulf, so it's been really fascinating for me to kind of listen to all this kind of deeply embedded analysis of what's going on there. I've learned a lot just by listening to the panelists, particularly around the idea that this is it's a very complex problem, right? There's a lot of moving pieces going on. And I think that what I've learned as well is that the context of the Gulf, it's not new, right? So we've got an interesting kind of historical context put in place by Matt. And it's also, it's not necessarily different from other places, right? It's not unique in many of the fundamental aspects that are at play here in terms of the different types of labor chains that might be in place, in terms of the kind of regulation that might be in place, in terms of guest worker programs and those sorts of things. So it's not necessarily new, it's not necessarily unique, but there are some specific characteristics of it that are very important. and which all the panelists have raised, which I think are really significant and worth kind of thinking further on. There's clearly a lot of things that that I can bring to this conversation, which really focus on the kind of business aspects of it, which have come up in the conversation a little bit, particularly with what Fabian was saying. There's clearly lots of actors at play in this. But I think one thing I really pull out of the conversation was that we can't necessarily rely on governments to solve the problem, right? And so the role of business, I think, is going to be a crucial one in addressing this issue. I want to say a few things just around that, and try and put a bit of context around this idea of what it is and how it might feed into potential solutions. So from a business point of view, I mean, the panelists have talked about labour chains really as a way of, as a means of getting people from here to there, right, of migrants migrating, and that the labour chain is the kind of way in which they do that. From a business perspective, a labour chain is it's a series of relationships designed to create and capture value, right? That these are ways in which firms offer services to either individuals or to other firms, which enable them to bring labour through this chain so that it ends up in productive use somewhere. All right. Those firms will be kind of creating this value in different ways. Right. So they're doing this service, and then they'll try and capture the benefits of that service in the form of profit or some other benefit. All right. So everyone in these chains does something which ideally is worth something. They get paid for, and that payment must be above their cost of production, right? It's a basic kind of business way of understanding what a labour chain is. Now, normally when we think about supply chains, we think about them as product supply chains, right? So, and that's fairly straightforward way of thinking. You're passing bits of commodities from one place to another, and then you're doing something like commodity, making it more valuable, and then selling it to somebody else. When we think about a labour chain, it gets a bit complicated, right? Some of the principles are the same. We're still providing services to people along the way, but we're talking about people, not commodities, right? So some things are fundamentally different. So people make choices, commodities don't, and people have their own needs in relation to perhaps trying to capture some of that value, which commodities don't, right? So those are the kind of nuances that I think I'm going to try and pull in as I'm just talking briefly through this. So why do labour chains exist then? And I think Matthew's talked about this kind of historically, they're about ensuring an appropriate labour supply, right? Getting the right people at the right time. In the Gulf, we just haven't got the right people at the right time, and so you have to bring them from somewhere else, right? But they also are a way of reducing costs, right? You could employ other people to do it at a much higher cost, and they also increase flexibility, and Elizabeth talked about some of these things as well, right? So if you have migrant workers, particularly temporary workers, as Elizabeth said, you can easily fire them. They increase your flexibility as a firm. It also decreases your kind of risk, your liabilities. You don't have your own workers. You find them from somewhere else, and everyone kind of outsources their risk along the supply chain. So the key issue then is that migrant workers are cheaper and more flexible than non-migrants, right? That's the core of how a labour chain operates, why it exists, right, from a business point of view. And the business demand for cheap, flexible labour at one end of the chain provides the pull that pulls people through. Now, obviously, when we're talking about labour chains, obviously the humans have agency in that, right? It's not just a pull. They're choosing to engage in these labour chains, they're choosing to migrate in some contexts. In other contexts, it might be much less agency or volition involved when we particularly talk about a forced labour situation. So how can companies manage then these labour chains? And in this, I was really struck by a comment I heard once at a business conference on modern slavery. And it was talking about the UK context, but it could have been anywhere. And it was a senior executive at a hotel chain. And he said, look, I can tell you the farm where the steak on your plate came from that was serving in the dining room. Probably even the name of the cow, he said. But we have no idea where the workers came from that work in our kitchens. right? And I think that's the fundamental problem that we have with labour chains, labour supply chains, is that you have firms, and in the Gulf we're talking about hotel chains, construction companies, we're talking about oil companies, we're talking about a whole range of firms which are using workers and they won't necessarily know where they've come from. It's the whole transparency over the provenance of those workers that's important. And
Andy, can I jump in real quick? Because there's a really good question we had from the audience that I think goes kind of right to that, and that's a question from Rumcha Shazat. And Rumcha asks, as far as kind of what are the regulatory things that can be brought to bear? Is the UK Modern Slavery Act something that actually will be useful in dealing with that transparency? I don't know if you could maybe weave that in, because I think it was a great question on Rumcha's part.
Yeah, I mean, transparency is crucial, and good regulation can improve transparency. Let's call it better regulation than the Modern Slavery Act will be able to increase transparency. It's an attempt, it's a first step, all those things, it's been reviewed, it's going to be improved, but at the moment it doesn't actually require firms to be particularly transparent. And also, it's focuses specifically on product supply chains, and firms are not very aware of the transparency in their labour supply chains, and that's where the real problem comes here. Right, so I guess kind of where this leaves us is, how do firms get transparency over their labour supply chains? And Fabienne talked about some of the various initiatives that are going on, which many of them are really interesting, some of them are quite powerful, around responsible recruitment, ethical recruitment. There's all sorts of things that we talked about there. And I think I'll just end on what I think are the two limits to those. And I think it built that in as well to the kind of problem with the Modern Slavery Act. Those initiatives tend not to go much beyond tier one in the labour supply chain, right? So the immediate person who the agent, the intermediary, who the worker was hired from. But if we're talking about a chain, we know there were other people before that, some more formal, some more informal. So how do you get transparency and some kind of responsibility for those actors, I think is a crucial one that I think would be interesting to talk to the panelists about that. And then secondly, all of these initiatives around ethical recruitment, they add costs and they reduce flexibility, which are the key reasons why the labour supply chains operate in the first place. So unless it can add value in other ways, right? So if it can add value by ensuring a better or more consistent workforce, right? If you get better workers because of these systems, then it has value. But if it doesn't, then it runs counter to the purpose of labour supply chains in the first place, and therefore you're not going to get broad uptake of them amongst the actors who you want to have uptake, which are those perhaps at the bottom end of the system. So, turning to the panelists, we'll go into the Q&A, but I think it'd be interesting to discover from you what you think about the role brands can take and what responsibility they should have in these labour supply chains, how far that should go, and whether there are better or worse ways of doing that based on your own experience. Thank you.
So we've got a couple of minutes where I'm going to relay some audience question and answers to our panelists. And I'd first like to ask Fabienne, Sarah Lazar asks, what is the future of construction in the Gulf states with COVID-19 and everything else? I'm assuming that it's going to be all ahead full because the World Cup and the UAE's exhibition and other things are definitely going to happen. But do we think that this kind of 20 years worth of intensive mega projects, is that what the next 20 years looks like after COVID?
I think it's such a pertinent question at this moment that we're in, especially with the kind of looming crisis that we all kind of know is coming in different contexts, but it's particularly acute in terms of migrant workers who are very heavily employed in the construction industry in the GCC. I think we don't know what it looks like for the next 20 years, but I think what we're seeing are the kind of built-in risks which have already been, and could potentially be significantly exposed going forward. I think when it comes, one interesting factor you mentioned, the Expo in UAE, which is due to the kind of cultural, international cultural event, which was due to occur in the coming months, but has largely been delayed, I think, until early 2021. Like I said, that is happening. But again, most of the construction has actually already been done. When we talk about the World Cup as well, due to happening in 2022, again, I think more than 80% of the construction has already been completed. But I think it's indicative of the fact that actually throughout the COVID-19 crisis, and while measures were taken by the Qatari government, and also by the actual World Cup organisers to try to reduce the spread of COVID-19 amongst workers, construction continued. It was one of the few industries which did not stop. Obviously, there have been slowdowns, but I think World Cup construction continued. And actually, very sadly, yesterday there was a statement released by the World Cup organisers that a worker had died from COVID-19. And I think it was confirmed that 1,000 workers, or at least there was a media report which stated that 1,000 migrant workers had contracted COVID-19 as well. Where the industry goes, I think if we look to its existing kind of risks, like what I mentioned about the work that I did with construction engineering companies before, one of the key issues was the fault lines. Their margins are very tight. And this also speaks to something that Andy was talking about, the transparency issue. One of the more positive steps that we've seen taken as part of the reform process that Elizabeth mentioned at the beginning is, so a few months ago in 2019, the ILO and the Labour Ministry in Qatar signed a pledge with, I think, 6 different state-owned contractors to essentially include recruitment costs, make them actually factored into the bidding process for construction. And that's so striking, because these projects are dependent on migrant workers, but they weren't aligned, often were not actually aligned in the budget that the project kind of costing that competing contractors would put forward. So actually just the fact of making that requirement is quite significant, and hopefully will increase some of the visibility. So it's an industry which operates on fine margins, and I think this crisis, it's already having an impact on the workers who were employed in that industry, and where the industry goes from here, I think it is definitely something of significant concern.
Excellent, thank you.
We're
ahead.
doing a speed round of the audience questions now, so trying to get as much in before we close. This one is for you, Elizabeth. The question from Sarah Lizar, wondering about the agency of the domestic workers themselves. She writes, terms like modern day slavery, trafficked persons tend to belittle the important changes migrants have brought both to themselves and the folks they left behind in the face of all the difficulties and severe exploitations they live to. Oh, sorry, that's from Teferi Adam. So if you could speak to that role of agency and the...
Sure, yeah, it's a good question. Thanks for raising it. I do agree that the term modern slavery and trafficking, while useful where they compel action by states and companies, they tend to be labels that are othering, that are victimizing, and they're not ones that have been readily identifiable to workers, that have appealed to workers to self-identify that way. On the question of agency, organizing of domestic workers has been notoriously difficult because of the isolated nature of their work. But there have been huge strides made in recent years, and one of the key examples I'd point to that the Open Society Foundation supports is the International Domestic Workers Federation, the first ever federation, global union for domestic workers, which now has 67 affiliates in 54 countries with more than 600,000 domestic worker members. Many of them are migrants, not all of them. And one key achievement of many of the groups in the IDWF and the grassroots organizations of domestic workers around it happened in 2011 with the passage of ILO Convention 189, which is the first piece of global international legislation that recognizes domestic worker rights as work rights. It's an incredibly important precedent. So since then, there have been, I think, almost 30 countries that have ratified that, but it's a testament to domestic workers, largely grassroots groups, pulled it off, mostly women. So it's a great example, and we've got a long way to go, but I think we're heading in the right direction.
Well, one of the things I think that we've seen with all of the slaveries that get studied at the Gilder Lehrman Center is that emancipation is usually not something that is given to the communities. It is something that is taken by the people. And I think that to end on that, as far as the fact that, you know, we often talk about the Gulf as though there's these powerful, rich governing families and a whole lot of totally powerless workers. And I think every time I go there and every time I hear people talk about the research they're doing there, what we see is a lot of very talented workers and very talented communities, just like you mentioned, Elizabeth. So thank you to our panelists for helping reflect that reality. What would make somebody swim all the way to that ship for freedom? What makes them come together collectively to try to make sure their voices are heard? And hopefully we've been able to move their voices out into the public sphere a little bit today. David, I'll hand it over to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Lou. Thanks, Kate. And thanks to all the panel. I think I would just conclude by saying that I heard so many tones here today in this terrific panel that you can also hear in all the writings and speeches and commentaries and pamphlet literature of the original abolition movement, be it the British movement or the American movement of the 1830s, 40s, and 50s. They were always trying to stop now and then and measure their progress. Elizabeth used the term progress earlier. They were always trying to say, how much progress have we made here? And sometimes the answer was not very much. Sometimes the answer was despair, such as in the wake of the Fugitive Slave Act, for example, of 1850 or something like that, or the Dred Scott decision of 1857. Other times they would measure their progress in their numbers, in the sheer scope and scale of the dissemination of their information and their persuasion and their arguments. But they also measured their progress, I think, in their own kind of research. Now, it wasn't the sophisticated research that you all are doing by any means, nor with this enormous international network of organizations and NGOs. But their research often was simply recording the stories of slaves, recording the stories of the people they were freeing, or publishing the stories of the people they were trying to free. And I think, and I hope our audience out there will keep reading about this, will keep reading you, Elizabeth, Fabian, Andy, and Matt, and Lou and Kate and all the rest. Because ultimately what's worth understanding here, well, it's all worth understanding, but how a worker in Kathmandu somehow gets recruited and ends up in Qatar building an Olympic stadium or a World Cup stadium, or how a worker in Bangladesh ends up in Oman or someplace, is the story you are all revealing in all of its horror. I mean, I can still remember reading Matt Hopper's book and learning about the sheer hideousness of pearl diving, the terror of it. It's kind of down at that level where this new field, if it's now a field, takes us to understand this system. But it also takes the sophistication of all of you to understand this world of business operations, this world of supply chains, be it commodities or human beings. And you know, the abolitionists of 1850 didn't believe they'd live to see the end of slavery, most of them, but they did, at least in that version of it. So who knows where we're all going now. Special thanks again to all of our team here at the Gilder Lehrman Center for coordinating and planning all of this, and Daniel for making it happen, and Song for making it happen. I just want to say at the very end, at the Gilder Lehrman Center, we very much welcome your donations. I'm sorry to have to say that, but we are in a fundraising mode to support our future of programming like this and many other aspects of our operation. And so all you got to do is go to the site at which you signed up for this, click on the GLC website and click donate and help us out if you choose. Thank you for all of you out there for attending, and thanks especially to the panel. I'm David Blight at the Gilder Lehrman Center. Thanks everybody for joining us. Take care, stay healthy, be well.